everyone, for joining us today. As he said, I'm Frances Simowitz. I'm the CEO of WEVE Acceleration. Just really quickly before we dive into the conversation, WEVE is a soft landing accelerator program based out of the United States that helps international companies scale into the US market through a 10-week cohort-based program. We have offices on the West Coast as well as New York, and have gotten the opportunity to work with more than 300 founders across more than 30 different nationalities around the world. And I'm really excited to be here today with Ciaran, who is one of our alumni from the summer of 2021. So thank you so much, Ciaran, for joining us.
You're very, very welcome. Thanks very much for having me. Do you want me to give you a quick overview on
Would love that. Yeah,
Swoop?
if you could give us a little bit more info about Swoop funding and kind of maybe the start of your journey and the decision points to go to the US market.
Super. So yeah, my name is Ciaran, co-founder of Swoop, and what our business is a financial platform for small businesses to access financial products using their data to get access to those financial products. So loans, investment, grants, banking, that sort of thing. We'll be 5 next month, and in that time we've started to expand out the marketplace because ultimately access to finance isn't unique to one particular geography. We initially started our home markets, which was Ireland and the UK, and have since expanded it out to Australia and now North America. And as Frances said last summer, before kind of stepping into the American market directly, we wanted to kind of understand the market and its differences compared to how we operated within the UK and Ireland markets. So any cultural differences, any regulation, a big part of how we scale our business is kind of through partnerships and embedding our technology in other places. So understanding was there a market from that, and then ultimately is also, as we look to operationalize it, understanding the cost base, because obviously there's a lot of variety between the 50 different states and what you need to consider. So we kind of wanted to use WEVE as a kind of a test case to test out all our theories and see what stacked up.
Yeah. So when it came to making the decision to go to the market, right? Because it's a very big and complex market. I think oftentimes when we talk to founders, there's a hesitancy about, it was now the right timing, or I don't have enough of a product yet, or I don't have enough funding yet, or a big enough team. What for you made you feel like now is the right time to go to the US?
Yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to also the size of the market. So a lot of businesses, probably similar to Swoop, are going through funding rounds. So you're always trying to be forced to shoot to the stars from whoever your investor set is. And certainly when we looked at the US market, the size of it in the space we operate, which is alternative finance, it was the largest alternative finance market in the world. So we knew that the size of the prize was particularly large. But as you also rightfully alluded to, you don't have an infinite amount of cash, so you can't just slam a big, massive team in there and hope it's all going to go to plan. So we kind of had to think through, okay, how do we start to get access to this? How do we get traction? What are the tactics you can do to do that? Fortunately, a lot of our business is online and it's tech-based, so it gives you a low barrier to test things out. So for us, it was pretty easy for us to spin out a US kind of website or interface pretty early on and start to see kind of US customers trickle through, understand them, see how we were able to operate and chat to them and learn from them, which is kind of a low test model. And you can use obviously the information to kind of shape your future strategy, but also as a proof point to go and get a further investment to kind of accelerate your plans. Great.
When it comes to starting to scale, you mentioned, from the beginning, you can't necessarily have a team to start, but you've now started to actually build out and hire in the US market. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so for us, we were always kind of able to identify certain functions that you can kind of centralize, so it doesn't really matter where they're based around the world. And for us, that was kind of product and engineering. We were always able to centralize that, and we don't necessarily need them to be in a specific location. The same as our kind of top of the funnel function, so from your partnerships, your SEO, your paid, organic, social media, again, you can kind of centralize quite a bit of that. So the key bits from an operational point of view that we need to start to think about are anyone that has to be customer facing, whether that's going out and meeting kind of new partners, or whether that's any kind of people coming through, customers of any issues, or from an operational capacity, how you set up from regulation, how you have all your licensing set up, and anything like that. A kind of a face to the name if anyone comes knocking. So it was understanding what are those key roles, how much they cost relative to the various different states and territories you can think through, and then putting a bit of a plan in place, and also time zones are important to think through as well, because we had gone into Australia the year before. And it's an absolute horrendous time zone difference between obviously Ireland and Australia, or UK and Australia, and it gets even worse for 6 months of the year, where you basically get like a 1 hour shared work, and then kind of this period about 3 hours of shared work. And it's really hard from a cultural perspective when someone's starting their day or someone's finishing their day to have those kind of moments of sharing and working collaboratively, particularly where you have the central functions and you want to make sure you have a huge amount of overlap between time you're spending with them. So from our side of thinking, we were like, never really considered the West Coast because we wanted to have as much coverage in terms of times between kind of central functions and any new members of staff that we were bringing on, because we noticed from an onboarding point of view with our Australia business, it just took a lot longer to get that in place.
Yeah, and I feel like you also touched on a lot of the other complexities as well, from time zones to regulations. What were maybe some of the biggest surprises you had when you came to the market? Like, what did you expect, and then what did you actually find there?
I think maybe it's not an obvious one, but federal versus state. So don't take everything for granted that just because it's kosher in one state, it's going to work for everything across the country. So one thing we were fortunate in the main in that, like, the key regulation from a Swoop perspective is broking or intermediating kind of loans or credit. Thankfully, from our part, you can kind of get blanket coverage across the states, with the exception of California. So that was the one area where we needed to kind of get licenses, and also because we work with partners and banks, they kind of want you to be over-regulated or have good kind of qualifications that aren't necessarily like you don't necessarily need them to trade, but in order to land partnerships, often you need them. So for anyone who's familiar with kind of data in Europe, ISO 27001, very long-winded stamp of approval, but it's kind of like the stamp of approval that you kind of need to say, we know how to manage data, we know how to share data, we know how to store it, centralize it, that sort of thing. And the US have something similar called SOC 2. So it's important for us to understand that. How do we get access to that? So those kind of things, and then seeing if there's any kind of state-by-state differences was pretty important, I would say, as well. And also, actually, the formation of the business itself, you can kind of get out of the blocks pretty quickly with like a branch, or you can go for a Delaware. But sometimes if you want to get investment from a US firm, in some instances, it's becoming increasingly more rare, but they'll make you flip all of your structure so that Topco is US. So it's just something to be aware about. If you are going through investment and you are going and looking at US-based investors, there may be a requirement there. Fortunately, from our point of view, we were able to kind of keep our Topco as Irish and initially start with a kind of a Delaware-based company from a US perspective.
Yeah, and that's not always easy to do with the investors in the US. A lot of times, as you say, they want to see you do the full Delaware flip because that's the best tax incentive for the investors. On that, we see a lot of companies all the time coming from Europe that, want to raise investment from the US. The valuations are higher. There seems to be a lot of advantages to it. It feels like it's going to be really easy to do, but it isn't always. So what was your experience working with US investors, and what were some of the differences you saw between European investors and the US side?
Yeah, I think a lot of people talk about the differences, but there genuinely is quite a few differences. Our previous fundraise that we did, we took on US investors as part of the last fundraise, and we're currently going through one at the moment. And there's a considerable difference between them, and I also see the differences between the stages. So the last round we did would have been kind of seed Series A, and the US-based investors were, I wouldn't say, the steps to get to the cash were a lot shorter. So you had that initial meeting kind of traction bit, and if there was buy-in, and they wanted to move quickly, and everything ran very, very, very smoothly and very quickly, and cash was sent very, very quickly, relative to the European side of things or the UK-based side of things, where it was a lot more sequential, step-by-step rounds of different meetings, different ICs, clarifications around data, and then the due diligence process itself of kind of going alongside the legal firm, whoever they had hired to go through the various different stages, and it was just a lot longer. However, this time round, I think the US firms, maybe because we're at a later stage, definitely are still more expedient in terms of wanting to move things along in a lot more quicker fashion. But they are a lot more inclined to go deep on the data. Because we're a marketplace platform, there are certain metrics that you really want to know inside out. So for anyone who has a marketplace platform, understanding your cohort analysis is super important. And if you have any sort of SaaS element to your business, we have a SaaS product that we rent out to accountants and brokers, and understanding your relativity of how much you can get now versus if this investment comes in, and really understanding that inside out is super important to be able to be tip your tongue, articulate all those kind of key points. And a lot of the US firms will fixate on that kind of cohort analysis or how you can talk about your SaaS scaling capabilities. Whereas the European counterparts, very much into that, but it's just a lot longer and going through various kind of more classic due diligence stages.
Yeah, it is much faster in the US once you get to that point.
Yes.
Also, when it comes to investment, I feel like there's a chicken and egg kind of scenario between traction and wanting investment. Like a lot of companies are like, we want to raise investment, and then we'll actually build out in the market, versus, a lot of investors want to see traction first. Can you talk a little bit also about building out the traction in the US and what investors cared about from that perspective?
Yeah, I think traction is probably one of the most important things you can do. I think you see that from like pre-seed, seed. It's very hard to get any sort of check, no matter what stage you're at, without showing any form of traction. It's not like in the past you would be able to raise a lot just based on team or connection alone, whereas now you really need to show some level of traction. And we've even found that in this current fundraise, where we've made good connections with US funds, where they're like, you're not quite far along yet, so please keep in touch, but we're not, you have to go prove it even further. So the more you can demonstrate is super important, and showing how you can show it's relevant to a US audience is because they don't automatically buy just because it works in one jurisdiction. It's automatically going to work there. Obviously, if you're coming from an English-speaking country, it's a lot easier because you're not having any of the kind of changes around language or kind of natural language areas, which is an important one in the reverse when you try and scale within Europe, which is probably even more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when it comes to those things, like having a good network matters a lot. Oh, thank you. Oh, we have a question. So in terms of strategy, how was strategy approached since the very beginnings in terms of sustainability and diversity, while also keeping an eye on scaling and getting profitable?
Sorry, say what?
So I think it's around what was your strategy from the beginning to build in approaches of sustainability and diversity, also while keeping your eye on being a profitable business?
Yeah, I mean, we're still striving for that profit yet, so I'll let you know when we get there. So yeah, that's a big key focus for us this year with this fundraise is to get profitability, so we can never have to do a fundraise again. But on the sustainability point, I think it becomes very, very important. It's obviously very important no matter what size of business you are or what sector you're in, but it has increasingly bigger weighting depending on kind of sector level. In our particular industry, because it's quite tech heavy, it's online, there isn't in our kind of supply chain that much of kind of a focus on it. Where we kind of come into it is where we work with partners. So a facet of Swoop is you can come directly as a small business and come on the platform and get access to finance, but we also embed that. So we embed the product into banks or other institutions. So one would be, say, NatWest Bank in the UK. A lot of these banks have ESG quotas or mandates in which they have to achieve. So you, by that nature, need to demonstrably show what you're doing from a sustainability point of view. So we've chosen and elected to go with a qualification called EcoVadis, and essentially they come and monitor you and track you and give you a score. So we're currently a silver, and give you kind of a touch points and kind of where you can kind of improve yourself going forwards. I think also from a diversity standpoint, I think I always find this a kind of an interesting one, because I would like to hope anyone from Swoop would just not really have to think about it as something that they would be trying to proactively do. It just will be embedded in everyone's kind of DNA. So, I mean, my co-founder is female. We have a pretty even gender split within all of the teams at Swoop, but we would, I think, one of our key facets within our kind of our culture and our values is to have a global mindset. You can't have a global mindset unless you have an openness and understanding of kind of other people's cultures, no matter whether it's race, sexuality, gender, anything like that. So if you're not showing that kind of values kind of pretty early on, it's not going to really be a fit for you. And I think if we kind of think and act in that way from the beginning, then how we interact with other customers or organizations will reflect that we naturally think in what I would consider just a normalized way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we have another question, and thank you. I mean, submit your questions. I'm getting them on the iPad. So another question from Greg. Did you notice any differences in finding, attracting, and hiring team members in the US as compared to Ireland and EMEA?
Yeah, so I think you like, especially if you're going for people that aren't naturalized Americans, visas and things are super important. So you have to kind of think through that element. The other element is like where you're going to base yourself, because the wage brackets are wildly different depending on which states you're in. And if you're going to New York, Jesus, bring your wallet. Like, it is absolutely crazy how expensive it is. So I would say key consideration is like where you're going to base yourself, and within that state, what are the kind of the salary brackets that you're going to be working within, because you need to be able to see if you can afford it first and foremost. And if the visa side of things can be incredibly complicated, so it is something to be kind of top of mind if you're going to be going after people that aren't necessarily going to be easy to onboard and hire. Other things to consider are when you are looking to bring people on, like in UK, Ireland, Europe, we will have long, the term when someone leaves and they have their notice period. Our notice periods are kind of relatively long. Low would be a month. High would be 6 months. Average is probably 2 or 3. In the US and Canada, it's like standard is 2 weeks. That can work good ways and bad ways and both ways. Good if you're trying to hire someone, they can be there pretty swiftly. But equally, if someone leaves you, you can be kind of left in the lurch pretty quickly. So one to be aware of. What else would I say?
Yeah, I feel like I also always tell founders too that, like, for example, sales is usually a big first hire. Americans are really good at selling themselves. It doesn't always mean they're going to be good at selling your company. I mean, like, I think that's just generally very true about salespeople in general. It's always, because like extroverts do better in the interviews, but introverts can be just as good at selling. So it is good to think through your tactics in terms of how you interview people and how you can kind of get deep in understanding their numbers or their past performance, because Francis is dead right. Like, often that first key hire is a sales-based person. So one of the best things that came out from being on the WEVE program was we got paired up with a mentor who set up the sales team of our biggest competitor in the US. So all we did was we booked a call and spoke to him and basically grilled his brain for a month, for a week, for an hour every single week for about 3 months.
and it was through him that he connected us into other salespeople that had worked in his team, so we could kind of understand what they deemed as good, what was good scores, what was good clues, how did they set up their teams, what was their process like, was there any differences. So actually, before going out and hiring someone, find out the type of people that you want to hire, spend time with them, understand what they think is good, what are the clues that they could find out, because that was a bit of a game-changing element for us, because Tom basically just showed us or laid out a huge blueprint on kind of how our competitors were set up, how they scaled, how they achieved to kind of where they are today, and it really helped us accelerate our thinking of who was the kind of person that we needed to bring in.
Yeah, Tom was the perfect lead mentor for you.
Yeah, it's great.
So another question from Stephen. What did you look for in an investor, and was there a preference for US over European ones given your market and expansion? And I guess that I feel like is a good question both for the Series A and now for the Series B.
Yeah. So I mean, the most obvious one is like who's going to give you the cash. But one thing is like if you should go out and meet as many investors as you can. Obviously, it's a horrendous time vortex and really takes you away from the business, but it's a necessary evil if you do have to go and do it. But one thing to try and do as early on as possible is try to get a term sheet as quickly as possible, because it's amazing how much more you can move things along if you do have an offer on the table and be able to kind of coerce people. From our business, yes, we do think about kind of what investors are going to help us. So from our side, like we're doing this fundraise at the moment. The key facets of the fundraise are to expand in the US, and also I was kind of describing this concept of embedded finance, where we put our product in behind other products like banks and other organizations. That basically requires people who've got really good connections to say, hey, talk to that person who's head up in this company. Or one investor recently was like, connect us into eBay so that we can now serve eBay and help their merchants. That often comes from very well connected in VCs. So what we're looking for is anyone that can connect us on a partnership level from the embedded finance, or who can help us, like say Francis did when we went into the US, to say talk to A and B for those key hire decisions, or operationally, this is how much you should be paying, or this is how much your contracts should be costing. So they were the key kind of considerations for us as to who might be a good investor from our side. Also, from a staging point of view, there's an element of like, how much involvement do you want? When you get more of the more mature VCs, they obviously have a project plan, a playbook, and that's why they're great, and they're going to put a huge amount of time into you, but you need to be able to willingly give that back in terms of operational hours, involving them in the business. Whereas maybe you want something that's more patient and you're ready to kind of build it up. So maybe it's more of an angel or a family office or a less hands-on operational VC. So also think about how you like to work and who you want showing up every 12 weeks. And that can also help steer the conversation as well.
Great. We have another question. What were some key cultural differences you noticed when scaling to the US? Were there things around the culture that really surprised you?
I think speed is a good one. Even like the way that I talked about, like them leaving job, moving job. If you're interested, let's actually move this along seriously. Like I was at a conference not too similar like this in Chicago last summer, and within 2 weeks we had set this bank up as a partner, already set up, doing funding through Swoop. Like they move so much more. If they're interested, they will move and they will go. So you move with them. And from my perspective, I love that. But if you're like, I suppose sometimes Irish people aren't direct. Like we love to beat the old bush, whereas Americans are like, let's get down to business. Let's move this along. So I think just be aware that if they're in it, they'll move things along, which I think is great. I think. What else, I suppose, from a cultural point of view, there is definitely differences, I think, between the different states as well, in terms of like speed, pace of life, how they think about things. So again, think of your product and your audience. Does that reflect, well, like New York is a fast-paced environment, that sort of things. But like, you might have a direct-to-consumer kind of more of a hipster brand. Get yourself over to Portland. I don't know. It's you need to think about like your audience, because again that might reflect on your employee base as well. So yeah, I would say there's different cultures within the States as well. But the biggest thing for me is their kind of directness and willing to move very quickly.
Yeah, even when pitching, I feel like a lot of times the founders aren't super direct. Like they don't talk about their successes and like how much traction they have, et cetera, which is like you have to talk about why you're awesome in the US and be really direct about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's shocking for an Irish person because like you go in and you do these kind of talks and they'll just be like this mad big introduction coming at you of everybody that's there, and it's a real culture shock.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so last question, I think. We'll see how much time we have. What are the core business capabilities that the U.S. investors want to see strengthen and quick scalability in versus EMEA, if any difference?
So I think, again, it goes back to your business model. So a lot of, I'd say, business models here might be in that B2B SaaS area. So what they want to see is, like, obviously, are you keeping your subscriptions? What's the length of the contracts? If someone comes on and transacts with that contract, how engaged are they throughout the life cycle of that contract? What are your renewals like? How many churns are you taking? How much does it take to earn to get a new contract? So like, what's the contribution margin? So yes, you may land 10 contracts this month, but how much of your team's efforts were required to go and land that thing? So how can you keep that contribution margin as high as possible? A big thing at the moment is like capital efficiency. So a big no-no is, well, I don't know, this is obviously general sweeping, but my perception of late, a big no-no is to have a high dependency on paid marketing. Yes, obviously great if you can show a good return on investment on your cost of customer acquisition, but to solely rely on paid marketing is a worry for some investors or a lot of funds. So where you can have a blended cost of capital from different routes, whether that's partnership driven or organic, can often be seen as a very favorable thing when you're demonstrating how you acquire customers, because that top of the funnel piece is really, really important in terms of like, how much does it cost me to get them? What are my channels that in which I can get them? Is there a good mix of those channels? And once they're in the door and I'm selling to them, how much time do I spend servicing them? And am I doing that in a kind of economical way? And then also, it's always about the upside, like what's left to do. So don't feel like you have to be like, I've absolutely nailed this completely. It's often good to say, actually, I've got like a C or a D in this area because we've just not done a particularly good job, or we haven't hired particularly well in this area. So actually, there's oodles of room here to improve, and they love to hear that. Just once you can kind of, like an economics professor or something, basically describe how you can get yourself from a D to an A, but they want to hear about those weaknesses as well, because you're not going to be able to be perfect everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great final point. I think being able, or at least for us, the founders we've seen most successful, like yourself, have been the ones that are open to that feedback. With that, we are at time. So thank you so much, Ciaran, for joining us. WEVE Acceleration has our applications open for our summer cohort. So happy to chat with any founders that might be considering going to the US market. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Francis. Cheers.